Behind the blood-soaked walls of Verdun lies a story written not only in steel and fire, but in the very soul of a nation. Let us uncover it. The winter of 1916 settled over France like a heavy shroud. The land lay frozen, yet the air above Verdun seemed to quiver thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and damp mud churned by shell fire. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones, for even silence seemed fragile here, as if the very earth remembered the weight of war pressing upon it. Germany, undeterred by failed Allied offensives of the previous year, prepared a new gamble. Its plan was not merely to win ground, but to bleed France dry, to sap its men, its morale, its very will to resist. On the opposite side of the lines, the French stood firm with a stubborn resolve. They had sworn to defend every inch of soil along the River Meuse. Each detonation in the distance was a reminder of their task, each comrade buried in the mud, a fresh scar on their determination. Hope was a tenuous thread, stretched but not yet broken. It was here in this corner of northeastern France that a harrowing saga was about to unfold, a saga of valor interwoven with horror, where human endurance would be tested in ways scarcely imaginable. Verdun was no ordinary town. Nestled 250 kilometers northeast of Paris, it carried the weight of centuries. Its name resonated in the French imagination not simply because of its location, but because it had so often stood at the crossroads of history. The Treaty of Verdun, signed in 843, had carved up the Frankish Empire, a decision that shaped the map of Europe for generations. Centuries later, during the Franco-Prussian War, Verdun had again borne witness to siege and resistance. And only a year earlier, in 1914, the town had resisted German encirclement during the First Battle of the Marne. Verdun was more than a fortress. It was a symbol, a sentinel that had watched over France for 1,000 years. By early 1916, that symbol was about to be tested as never before. The thunder of artillery in the distance hinted at the storm gathering across the German lines. Men in the trenches whispered of rumors, some claiming the Germans were bringing guns of unimaginable size, others that an offensive was imminent, but no one knew where. The French High Command reassured them that Verdun was safe, that it was protected by its formidable ring of forts. Yet beneath those words lingered doubt, for soldiers could see with their own eyes how the defenses had thinned, how the once strong fortresses seemed less like impregnable bulwarks and more like aging relics. And so, in the first weeks of that year, Verdun waited. The forests around the Meuse stood bare and skeletal, their branches like twisted fingers clawing at the sky. Villagers who had not yet fled clutched at their homes, as if unwilling to surrender their lives to the tide of history. French soldiers, cold in their trenches, clung to their rifles and to a stubborn pride. They knew the Germans were preparing something vast, something terrible. What they did not yet know was that Verdun was about to become the stage for the longest, most brutal battle of the Great War, a crucible in which the spirit of France itself would be tested. To understand why Verdun became the chosen battlefield, one must look beyond the trenches of 1916 and peer into the long corridors of history. Verdun was never just another fortified town. It was, in many ways, a cornerstone of France's national identity, a city whose soil carried the sediment of centuries of blood treaties and survival. The first time Verdun entered the chronicles of Europe in a defining way was nearly 11 centuries before the First World War. In 843, the Treaty of Verdun was signed, an agreement that divided the Carolingian Empire into 3 realms among the grandsons of Charlemagne. This was no mere boundary change. It was a fracture in the empire that set the stage for the modern map of Europe. France, Germany, and the Middle Kingdom, that would later dissolve into contested territories, all trace their geopolitical lines back to that moment. Verdun, the quiet town along the Meuse, was where this destiny had been written in ink and sealed with solemn oaths. But Verdun's role did not stop there. Again and again, history demanded that it stand as a bulwark. During the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71, Verdun endured yet another siege, its walls echoing with cannon fire as the French garrison resisted the Prussians for weeks. Though the town eventually fell, the siege became part of the lore of resilience. Veterans remembered the hunger, the cold, and the determination not to yield easily to foreign invaders. In Paris and beyond, Verdun's name was spoken with reverence, a reminder that the French spirit could outlast even the iron fist of Prussia. Fast forward to 1914, the opening months of the Great War. Germany swept through Belgium and northern France, aiming to encircle and crush the French armies in one decisive stroke. Verdun found itself once again under threat, encircled on three sides. Yet during the First Battle of the Marne, when French forces counterattacked and pushed the Germans back, Verdun endured. Its forts, its men, and its stubbornness contributed to halting the German advance just short of Paris. To the French public, Verdun had proven itself once more not just a fortress of stone and steel, but a fortress of national spirit. It was this history-heavy and immovable that cast its shadow over the events of 1916. When French soldiers looked upon the walls of Verdun, they were not seeing mere masonry. They were looking at a sacred site, a place sanctified by centuries of sacrifice. To abandon Verdun would have been to abandon France itself. In cafes and in the pages of Parisian newspapers, the message was repeated: Verdun must not fall. It was more than military strategy. It was a matter of pride, of symbolism, of collective memory. The Germans, too, understood this. Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn was no fool. He recognized that Verdun was not just a geographical point, but a psychological one. By striking here at the very heart of French memory, he believed he could wound France so deeply that the nation would seek peace. A fortress town revered in history could be transformed into a tombstone for French morale. In Falkenhayn's calculations, that was worth more than any stretch of land or village captured elsewhere. And so Verdun became a paradox. Its strength was also its weakness. Because the French loved it so fiercely, they would commit endless resources to defending it. Because they would defend it at all costs, Falkenhayn was certain he could bleed them white. He did not intend to conquer Verdun in the traditional sense, to occupy and hold it. He wanted to make it a meat grinder where France would pour in divisions and never retrieve them. This was the cruel genius of the plan, but also its horror. Soldiers understood instinctively that they were not being asked to defend simply a fortress. They were being asked to defend France's very soul. When men marched up the road toward Verdun, they were not just moving toward a battle. They were stepping into the pages of history, into a saga that stretched back over a millennium. To imagine what this meant for the ordinary soldier, consider a young French conscript in 1916, perhaps only 20 years old, trudging through the cold with a pack that dug into his shoulders. He may have heard from his father or grandfather stories of the siege of 1870. He may have read in school about the Treaty of Verdun. Now he was part of that continuum, drawn into a story that had already been told 100 times, but which demanded new blood, new endurance, new sacrifice. The French High Command was not blind to this. They knew that if Verdun fell, it would not only endanger Paris militarily, but would also devastate national morale. Soldiers elsewhere on the front might lose faith. The population at home might despair. The Allies might begin to question France's strength. Thus, Verdun was elevated from a fortress to a symbol, and symbols must be defended at any cost. Writers, poets, and journalists of the time played their part in cultivating this image. Articles described Verdun as the shield of France, the line that must never break. Propaganda posters evoked the town as a sentinel watching over the nation, its forts like guardians of a sacred flame. Even before the Great Battle began, Verdun was already fighting in the realm of imagination, a place where myth and memory interwove. This intertwining of past and present gave the coming battle its terrible intensity. For the Germans, Verdun was the key to breaking French spirit. For the French, it was the altar upon which they would prove their resilience to the world. And in this clash of perception, every hill, every trench, every fort would become imbued with symbolic weight. Côte 304 was not merely a ridge, it was a measure of endurance. Dead Man's Hill was not simply a piece of high ground, it was a testament to mortality itself. As the German guns began to roll into position in early February 1916, the stage was set for something that transcended ordinary warfare. The ground at Verdun was about to become a palimpsest, another layer of blood written over the centuries of struggle. The soldiers did not know yet how long it would last or how many lives it would claim, but they sensed in their bones that Verdun was destiny, that the name itself demanded sacrifice, demanded that they hold the line even when hope seemed lost. And so, when the bombardment finally began on February 21st, Verdun was not just a battlefield. It was history, memory, and myth all colliding in one place. The men who fought there would carry not only rifles, but the unbearable weight of their nation's story on their shoulders. At the heart of Verdun's defense lay more than men and morale. It lay in stone steel and ingenuity. Surrounding the town was the Région Fortifiée de Verdun (RFV), an elaborate system of fortifications that had been conceived in the anxious decades following France's humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. To the men of 1916, these forts were not simply military installations, they were monuments of national recovery, physical embodiments of France's determination never again to be caught unprepared. The RFV was immense in scale. Over 20 major forts and more than 40 smaller works encircled Verdun, their construction spanning from the 1870s into the eve of the First World War. Each was strategically positioned to command roads, ridges, and valleys. Seen on a map, the network looked like a great stone crown resting on the hills around the town, each fort a jewel set to protect the vulnerable arteries leading toward Paris. Among them, two names would soon burn themselves into history: Fort Douaumont and Fort Vaux. Douaumont completed only 3 years before the battle was the largest and most modern of the line. With its reinforced concrete armored gun turrets and subterranean galleries, it seemed the very embodiment of modern military science. Vaux, smaller and older, lacked Douaumont's scale, but was nonetheless formidable, a labyrinth of dark corridors, gun emplacements, and underground barracks designed to withstand bombardment. Soldiers stationed in these forts often remarked that they felt both entombed and protected, wrapped in walls that muffled the outside world, but also reminded them of how trapped they might one day be. The engineering of these defenses was itself a marvel. Designers buried the forts beneath thick layers of earth to disguise them from artillery and aerial observation. Armored turrets could rise from the ground fire, their massive guns, and then sink back into the earth like some mechanical beast retreating to its burrow. Underground galleries stretched like arteries, connecting living quarters, storerooms, and firing chambers. Here, life for the garrisons was a strange mixture of tedium and terror. On quiet days, soldiers drilled in echoing corridors, played cards under the dim glow of lanterns, or listened to the distant rumble of the front lines. They might share bread and thin soup voices bouncing off the stone walls, while somewhere above, frost collected on the earthworks. Yet even in these lulls, the forts carried an air of unease. Every man knew that should a German offensive come, these walls would no longer be their shelter, but their tomb. The stale air, the narrow staircases, the iron doors that sealed them and all could quickly become traps if the enemy broke through. Still, the forts gave confidence. When French soldiers passed them on the roads, they often tipped their caps as if in salute. Civilians believed in them as guardians of the nation. Paris reassured itself that Verdun was secure because of them. To the French high command, however, the forts were a double-edged sword. Chief of Staff Joseph Joffre, skeptical of static defenses, had already stripped them of many of their guns by 1915. To him, the forts were outdated relics, unsuited to the era of massive artillery. He preferred to keep the heavy guns and mobile batteries elsewhere. As a result, Douaumont, itself the pride of the RFV, was scarcely armed on the eve of the German attack, serving more as a barracks than a fortress. This decision would have consequences, though no one yet could foresee the scale of them. For now, the fort still stood silent guardians watching over the valleys of the Meuse. They were symbols as much as fortresses, reminders of France's vow after 1870 never to yield again. Beyond the forts stretched the trenches, dugouts, and outworks that knit the defensive line together. These were less glamorous, but no less vital. Here, men lived ankle-deep in mud rifles slung across their shoulders as they kept watch over no man's land. Communication trenches snaked back toward the town where supply depots and command posts hummed with activity. Horses clattered down frozen tracks, hauling shells and food. Ambulances jolted along behind them, carrying away the wounded from earlier skirmishes. Imagine a soldier on guard one bitter February night in 1916. He stands on the parapet of a forward trench, the horizon hidden by mist and the skeletal branches of winter trees. Behind him, faintly visible in the moonlight, rises the silhouette of Fort Douaumont, its earthworks blending with the hills. To him, that shadow is reassurance. Behind those walls lies shelter, and behind shelter, Paris. Yet he knows also that if the Germans break through, that shadow may become the last line between survival and ruin. The air is so still that he can hear his own breathing. He knows the forts are strong, but are they strong enough? The irony of Verdun's defenses was that their very presence attracted danger. To the Germans, Verdun was appealing not only because of its symbolic value, but because these massive fortifications promised to draw in French troops. Destroy the forts, Falkenhayn reasoned, and France would bleed men in endless waves trying to retake them. It was the perfect trap. Thus, by early 1916, the RFV stood ready but hollow. The outer appearance of might disguised the reality of undermanning stripped guns and a high command that underestimated their importance. And yet, for the soldiers stationed there, the forts gave purpose. They reminded men of France's past wounds and its determination to never repeat them. They were both sanctuary and bait, both shield and magnet. Soon, they would be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. The ground beneath Douaumont and Vaux would shake with the thunder of artillery, their walls cracked and scorched by shells. The corridors where men now played cards would fill with choking smoke. Pigeons would fly from their depths carrying desperate pleas for help. And in time, these forts would become names etched into memory, synonymous not just with stone and steel, but with sacrifice. For now, though, in those early weeks of 1916, the RFV still exuded a grim confidence. Verdun's guardians stood like sleeping giants on the hillsides. The men within waited unaware of how soon they would be called upon to endure the unimaginable. If Verdun was to stand, it needed more than forts and courage. It needed lifeblood. That lifeblood was the Voie Sacrée, the sacred way, an unassuming road that ran southwest from Verdun to the town of Bar-le-Duc, nearly 50 kilometers away. In ordinary times, it was just a rural road flanked by fields and scattered hamlets. But in 1916, it became the artery that kept Verdun alive. Without it, the fortress city would have been choked into surrender within weeks. When the Germans encircled Verdun from 3 sides, they left only this road open. Perhaps they thought it insufficient, a narrow ribbon of earth incapable of sustaining an army under siege. But the French transformed it into a miracle of logistics. From February to December 1916, the Sacred Way carried men, shells, food, and hope day and night, in rain and frost, under shellfire and aerial attack. General Philippe Pétain, newly appointed to command Verdun's defenses, understood from the start that holding the forts was impossible without holding the road. He poured his effort into organizing a system so efficient, so relentless, that it became legendary. Trucks rumbled along the road in an endless convoy, their headlights dimmed to slits, their engines coughing in the cold air. Horses pulled wagons stacked high with ammunition. Soldiers trudged beside them, shoulders stooped under the weight of packs, their boots caked in the sticky mud of the Meuse. Every 4 seconds, it was said, a truck passed along the Sacred Way. In one day, more than 6,000 vehicles could travel its length. The road became so battered by wheels and hooves that repair crews worked constantly, shoveling gravel and tamping down the ruts, even as convoys rattled past. The men who labored on it, spattered with mud and deafened by the roar of engines, were as crucial to Verdun's defense as any infantryman in a trench. There was no glamour to this duty. Road workers stood ankle-deep in muck, exposed to the cold and the occasional shell burst. They shoveled by hand, patched holes with whatever material they had, and guided convoys through the night with lanterns. Yet without them, Verdun would have starved. The Sacred Way was as much a battlefield as Douaumont or Vaux, though its battles were fought with shovels and grit instead of rifles. For the soldiers, the road became a rite of passage. They marched northward toward Verdun with heavy hearts, knowing many of them would never march back. Along the way, they saw the convoys of wounded returning faces pale under the moonlight, bandages soaked with blood. It was a haunting mirror, one stream of life flowing toward Verdun, another of broken bodies flowing away. One French infantryman later wrote that as he trudged along the sacred way, the endless rumble of trucks and the clatter of horses' hooves gave him the impression of a giant machine grinding and groaning, feeding itself on human lives. Another recalled the smell, the choking mix of gasoline, manure, and sweat that clung to the air day and night. Sleep was impossible. Even in the small villages along the road, windows rattled constantly from the vibration of wheels. Yet there was also pride. Soldiers knew they were part of something immense, something vital. When they reached Verdun and saw the battered fort still holding, they understood why the road mattered. Each step along the sacred way had been a step toward history. The road became sacred not only because of its role in logistics, but because of what it symbolized. It was France's lifeline, proof that even when surrounded on three sides, the nation could still breathe, still fight. Newspapers in Paris romanticized it, turning an ordinary country road into a legend. Artists painted it, writers described it as a river of determination. For civilians at home, the sacred way was reassurance that Verdun had not been abandoned. The Germans knew it too. They tried to disrupt the convoys with artillery and aircraft, but the road never ceased. If a section was cratered, men filled it in. If trucks were destroyed, new ones were brought forward. If horses collapsed from exhaustion, others were harnessed in their place. Nothing stopped the flow. Verdun lived because the road never died. One can imagine standing on the roadside one night in March 1916. The moon glints faintly off the wet stones. A convoy of Renault trucks roars past their drivers, gripping the wheels with frozen fingers. Behind them come carts piled high with shells, their iron rims sparking on the cobbles. Then columns of infantry appear, rifles slung over their shoulders, faces grim. They march in silence, boots slapping the ground in unison. In the distance, the horizon glows red with artillery fire. And all the while, the road groans beneath this endless procession as if the earth itself is straining to carry the burden. The sacred way was not without tragedy. Many died upon it, drivers caught in shellfire, horses collapsing under loads too heavy, soldiers struck down before ever reaching the trenches. For those who survived, the memory of the road lingered as strongly as any battle. One veteran described it decades later as a road paved with sacrifice, where every stone was a coffin. Still, the road endured. It embodied the resilience of France in 1916. Just as the fort symbolized defiance, the sacred way symbolized perseverance. It was the artery of a nation refusing to yield no matter the cost. By spring, the name had spread beyond Verdun. Soldiers across the Western Front spoke of the sacred way with awe. To march upon it was to join a brotherhood of endurance. To return along it wounded or broken was to bear witness to the price of survival. And to labor on it, repairing it under fire, was to give silently to the cause of France. Verdun might have fallen if not for that road. Without its steady stream of men and munitions, the forts would have crumbled, the trenches emptied, the spirit of France perhaps broken. But the road held. It carried not only supplies, but also the will of a nation, an unbroken chain between the home front and the battlefield. In the years after the war, the sacred way became hallowed ground. Monuments rose along its length, commemorating the soldiers, drivers, and laborers who had kept it alive. Pilgrims walked it in silence, imagining the thunder of trucks, the cries of horses, the tramp of boots that once filled the night. To this day, the name evokes not just a road, but a symbol of unyielding resolve. For Verdun was not defended by walls alone, nor by men alone, but by a road that never stopped carrying France's heartbeat into the fire. To the French, Verdun was far more than a fortress city. It was a talisman, a place where the spirit of the nation had been tested and preserved across centuries. Its fall would be unthinkable, not simply a tactical setback, but a psychic wound, a humiliation deeper than any battlefield loss. The French soldier trudging up the sacred way did not always articulate it in lofty terms, but he felt it instinctively. Verdun was France, and France was Verdun. To surrender one was to betray the other. For the Germans, Verdun carried an equal but opposite allure. It was not merely the chance to seize a strategic stronghold on the Meuse, but to strike at the very heart of French pride. General Erich von Falkenhayn, the German chief of staff, grasped this psychological dimension with ruthless clarity. He believed France could not endure a blow to Verdun. By hammering relentlessly at this sacred place, he could draw the French into a battle they could neither abandon nor win. This was the essence of his infamous plan, not conquest, but attrition. He called it Ausblutung, bleeding white. France, he reasoned, had already suffered heavy losses since 1914. Its manpower reserves were thinning. Its population was smaller than Germany's, its resources strained. If he could compel the French high command to pour division after division into Verdun, he would drain them until they collapsed. Verdun was the perfect trap. The French could not afford to lose it, yet to defend it would require sacrifices on a scale almost unimaginable. Falkenhayn did not need to break through their lines or march on Paris. He simply needed to let the French bleed themselves dry against the anvil of Verdun's forts. In his calculations, the balance of attrition would favor Germany. Every French casualty was a step closer to breaking the Allied line. Every German casualty, he told himself, was a lesser price, because Germany could bear it longer. It was a cold, clinical vision of war stripped of glory. Falkenhayn was no romantic strategist. He saw warfare as arithmetic, a grim ledger of gains and losses. Verdun to him was the perfect equation. France's pride made it predictable, and predictability was fatal. Yet, as with all plans, reality was less precise than theory. The German high command debated fiercely over the strategy. Some saw it as ingenious, others as reckless. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, Falkenhayn's rivals in the East, distrusted his fixation on Verdun. They favored decisive maneuvers and sweeping victories, not a grinding battle of attrition. But Falkenhayn's position in Berlin, fragile though it was, gave him the authority to push ahead. In late 1915, his decision hardened. Verdun would be the place. Not because its capture would open the road to Paris, though that temptation lingered, but because it would wound the French soul. To fall back from Verdun would be politically impossible for France. To hold Verdun would be militarily ruinous. It was a cruel logic, but it had its own dark brilliance. The French, meanwhile, sensed the danger, but underestimated the scale. Chief of Staff Joseph Joffre, whose confidence often bordered on complacency, had dismissed Verdun's forts as relics. He diverted guns and troops to other sectors, convinced that modern warfare was mobile and that static fortresses belonged to the past. By February 1916, many of Verdun's forts stood undermanned and underarmed. Douaumont, the jewel of the RFV, was little more than a barracks. This neglect was almost catastrophic. The very symbol that the French cherished had been stripped of its teeth. When the German offensive began, they would find gaps in the defenses wide enough to exploit. Verdun, the shield of France, was not as impregnable as the nation believed. But the symbolic stakes were so high that none of this mattered. When the first German shells began to fall on February 21, 1916, Verdun instantly became more than a battle. It became a contest of wills, a collision of identities. For France to abandon Verdun would mean admitting weakness, betraying centuries of history. For Germany to seize it would mean striking a blow so deep that it might force France to its knees. In this sense, Verdun was not chosen by chance. It was chosen because it was sacred ground for both nations, though in different ways. It was a battlefield where history itself was on trial. The French would defend it as though defending the graves of their ancestors. The Germans would attack it as though tearing down the altar of their enemy's faith. And in the midst of these abstractions stood the soldiers. Young men from Lorraine and Brittany, from Saxony and Bavaria, none of whom had drawn the maps or written the treaties. They would soon find themselves caught in the grinding jaws of Falkenhayn's strategy, their blood becoming the ink with which the next chapter of Verdun's history was written. The paradox was clear. Verdun was a fortress meant to protect life, yet it became a place where life was fed into the furnace of war. Verdun was a symbol of endurance, yet it was chosen precisely because that endurance would destroy those who upheld it. For both France and Germany, Verdun was not just a place on the map, it was destiny. And destiny has a way of demanding its price. The battlefield of Verdun did not emerge from nowhere. By the end of 1915, Europe had already been bled white across countless fronts. The Western Front stretched like a scar from the North Sea to the Swiss border, a line of mud and misery that had barely shifted since the first months of war. Millions of shells had been fired, hundreds of thousands of lives spent, and yet neither side could claim decisive victory. It was in this deadlock that Verdun's fate was sealed. France entered 1916 exhausted. The great offensives of the previous year, most notably the ill-fated Champagne offensive in September, had cost immense casualties for little gain. French soldiers called themselves poilus, the shaggy ones, not only for their unshaven faces, but for their weariness. They had seen comrades fall by the thousands and fields churned into wastelands, and still the lines held where they had been at the beginning. Behind the front, Paris was tense. The government promised victory, but mothers received telegrams. Villages grieved their lost sons, and industry strained to produce the shells and rifles demanded by the armies. France's manpower pool was already under pressure. Whole classes of young men had been drawn into uniform. Fields lay fallow factories, operated with older workers and women. The country was bleeding, and Verdun would soon cut deeper. The French High Command bore its share of the blame. General Joseph Joffre, commander-in-chief, remained confident in his strategy of great offensives, hurling mass divisions against German lines in the hope of breaking through by sheer force. To him, the forts of Verdun were an outdated relic of the 19th century. Modern war, he believed, was fought in the trenches, not in stone citadels. And so, in 1915, he stripped the Verdun forts of hundreds of guns and thousands of shells, reallocating them to other sectors. By early 1916, Verdun's mighty Douaumont fortress was guarded by a skeleton crew, its big guns removed. It was a dangerous miscalculation. For Joffre, Verdun was just another sector of the front, not the beating heart of France's pride, but the Germans understood otherwise. They saw that Verdun's neglect had made it vulnerable even as its symbolism made it irresistible. Meanwhile, Germany entered 1916 with greater optimism. In the east, the Central Powers had achieved victories against Russia during the Gorlice-Tarnów offensive. German and Austro-Hungarian troops had pushed deep into Russian Poland, forcing the Tsar's armies back across the vast plains. Though the Eastern Front was far from settled, Berlin believed it had blunted the Russian threat for the moment. In the Balkans, too, the Central Powers had triumphed. With Bulgaria's entry into the war in late 1915, Serbia had been crushed. German, Austro-Hungarian, and Bulgarian troops carved their way through the mountains, overrunning Belgrade and scattering the Serbian army into a desperate retreat across Albania. To German strategists, the Balkans now seemed secure. Even Italy's entry into the war on the side of the Entente in May 1915 had not yet tipped the balance. Italian offensives along the Isonzo River had bogged down in bloody stalemate, doing little more than draining Italian manpower without shaking Austro-Hungarian defenses. From Berlin's perspective, the war looked favorable. Britain's blockade bit at German industry, but morale remained high. Soldiers on the Western Front held strong positions in Belgium and northern France. And now, Falkenhayn saw an opportunity. If he could deal France a mortal wound, he might force them to sue for peace, leaving Britain isolated. The contrast between German confidence and French weariness was striking. In Berlin, newspapers spoke of the Central Powers advancing on all fronts, their victories in Serbia hailed as proof of inevitable triumph. In Paris, the talk was less certain. The Champagne offensive had cost dearly. The shadow of 1870 still lingered, a reminder of what happened when France faltered. And beneath the rhetoric of victory lay doubt that would soon explode at Verdun. The battlefield itself was already a cauldron. In the trenches, soldiers endured a life so harsh that death sometimes seemed a relief. Mud filled their boots, rats gnawed their food lice, tormented their skin. Shells shrieked overhead day and night, sometimes for days without pause. Men grew accustomed to the stench of rotting corpses half buried in parapets. Letters from home spoke of crops, births, deaths, ordinary life continuing as if in another universe. On the eve of 1916, the front near Verdun was deceptively quiet. Patrols crossed no man's land under the pale light of flares, snipers hunted shadows, and artillery thundered in the distance, but no great movement disturbed the line. Soldiers joked bitterly that they were safer here than in Champagne or Artois. They had no idea what was coming. In this fragile equilibrium, two things converged: German ambition and French complacency. The Germans, confident after victories elsewhere, believed they could launch an operation to tip the balance of the entire war. The French, drained by failed offensives, had neglected Verdun's defenses just when they were most needed. Thus, the stage was set. Verdun would not have been chosen if France had not loved it so fiercely, nor if Germany had not believed it so vulnerable. The convergence of history, pride, and opportunity created a battlefield that was almost inevitable. As winter deepened, trains carried German troops and artillery toward Verdun's sector. Massive guns, Krupp 420 mm howitzers, capable of smashing fortresses into rubble, were rolled into place under camouflage. Ammunition was stockpiled in staggering quantities. Engineers marked out positions. The German Fifth Army under Crown Prince Wilhelm prepared for its trial by fire. On the French side, little stirred. Joffre remained focused on other sectors. The fort stood quiet, their corridors echoing with the idle talk of understrength garrisons. Farmers trudged through frost-bitten fields nearby, unaware that their land was about to become an inferno. 1915 faded into 1916 with the front seemingly unchanged. Yet in Berlin, Falkenhayn had already written the first lines of Verdun's tragedy. His plan, simple in theory, but monstrous in execution, awaited only the right moment. When the bombardment began, the world would know that the long stalemate of trench warfare had given birth to something new, a battle not to seize territory, but to destroy the very endurance of a nation. And Verdun, with its stripped forts and sacred history, was the perfect place for it. In Berlin, the War Cabinet's halls echoed with tension. Erich von Falkenhayn, chief of the German General Staff, was a man carrying the burden of a war that seemed both promising and perilous. He was not flamboyant like Hindenburg, nor a fiery orator like Ludendorff. Falkenhayn was cold, methodical, and clinical, an officer who saw the war less as a matter of sweeping maneuvers and more as a grim calculation of endurance. Yet, even as the Central Powers had enjoyed victories in 1915, Falkenhayn understood the precariousness of Germany's position. The empire was surrounded. Britain unbroken at sea, France unbroken in the west, Russia wounded but still vast, and Italy newly hostile. Every day, the blockade tightened, choking Germany's access to food and raw materials. Every year, the armies fought without decisive victory, the greater the risk of Germany exhausting itself. Falkenhayn believed that time itself was the enemy, and time was not on Germany's side. He concluded that the war could not be won by chasing elusive, decisive battles on the Eastern Front. Russia, sprawling and resilient, could retreat, endlessly sacrificing territory, but preserving its armies. The East gives nothing back. Falkenhayn once remarked a bitter summary of his belief that crushing Russia was a mirage. Britain, meanwhile, was Germany's most formidable foe. Its naval blockade threatened starvation. Its financial power sustained the Allies and its troops, though smaller in number, were increasingly formidable. Yet Britain was insulated by geography and shielded by its fleet. A direct confrontation was impossible. So Falkenhayn looked to France. France was Germany's immediate adversary on land, the partner upon whom Britain's commitment hinged. If France could be broken, Britain might falter and the entire alliance might unravel. But where could he strike France most effectively? Not in Champagne, not in Artois. Those fields had already drunk oceans of blood with little result. He needed a place where France would be compelled by its own pride to fight to the death. That place, Falkenhayn concluded, was Verdun. His reasoning was simple and merciless. Verdun was both a fortress and a shrine. Its fall would devastate French morale, but more importantly, its threat would compel the French to defend it at all costs. They would pour men into the furnace because they had no choice. and Germany, entrenched on higher ground with overwhelming artillery, would slaughter them in droves. Victory in Falkenhayn's design was not about capturing the city. It was about draining France of her strength until she collapsed. The idea was daring, even audacious. Some within the German command questioned it. They wondered if Falkenhayn was sacrificing too much initiative gambling on attrition instead of a decisive breakthrough. They pointed to Hindenburg and Ludendorff's successes in the East victories that seemed glorious compared to the grim prospect of grinding France to dust. But Falkenhayn, wary of his rival's growing prestige, knew he needed a success of his own. Verdun offered not only military opportunity but political salvation. His rivalry with Hindenburg loomed large. Hindenburg, hero of Tannenberg, was adored by the German people. Ludendorff, his brilliant chief of staff, carried an aura of ruthless competence. Together, they embodied an alternative vision of the war, one that focused on the East that promised great encirclements and sweeping campaigns. Falkenhayn feared them as much as he did the Allies. If Verdun could bring him victory, it would silence his critics and secure his place in history. Yet even Falkenhayn was not entirely confident. He spoke vaguely of his plan in memoranda, careful never to fully articulate the strategy of attrition. To admit openly that he sought not victory but mass slaughter was dangerous politically and morally. He couched his words in language about weakening France and gaining advantage, but the essence was unmistakable. He intended Verdun to be a place of annihilation. To lend prestige to the operation, Falkenhayn placed the German Fifth Army under the command of Crown Prince Wilhelm the Kaiser's eldest son. At 34, Wilhelm was hardly a seasoned commander. He was more a figurehead than a strategist, known for his charm in Berlin salons rather than military genius. But his presence gave the battle royal significance, and Falkenhayn calculated that his own influence would remain secure if Wilhelm's staff relied on Berlin's guidance. Behind Wilhelm stood capable generals, men who would carry out the real planning while the Crown Prince became the public face of the offensive. Preparations began in secrecy. In the forests north of Verdun, German engineers dug gun pits for the largest artillery concentration the world had yet seen. Railway lines were extended to feed the monster guns. Stockpiles of shells, millions upon millions, were hauled in and hidden under camouflage nets. Soldiers rehearsed assaults on mock villages, practicing storming ruined houses and trenches. Everything pointed toward one goal: overwhelming firepower, relentless bombardment, and methodical advance. The offensive was scheduled for February 12, 1916, but the weather turned foul. Snowstorms swept the Meuse, visibility dropped to nothing, and the ground froze hard. Falkenhayn postponed, unwilling to waste the element of surprise. The delay lasted 9 days. In that time, French patrols sensed something stirring, but could not yet grasp its magnitude. The fort stood silent, the trenches tense, the sacred way alive with reinforcements, but the storm had not yet broken. When February 21st dawned at last, the sky over Verdun erupted. At 7:15 a.m., German artillery opened fire with a roar that shook the earth. Over 1 million shells rained down in 10 hours, smashing villages into dust, splintering forests into stumps, and burying men alive in their trenches. It was the prelude. Falkenhayn had promised the hammer of annihilation. Yet even then, he knew this was only the beginning. Verdun was not meant to be won in a day. It was meant to last, to stretch on, until France could no longer bear it. The gamble was set. If Verdun consumed France faster than it consumed Germany, Falkenhayn would be vindicated. If not, he risked plunging his own army into the same abyss he had prepared for his enemy. And so the fate of nations turned on one man's cold calculation that he could bleed France white on the hills of Verdun. At dawn, on February 21st, 1916, the air over the Meuse Valley held a silence that felt unnatural. Soldiers in the trenches rubbed their hands together against the cold, stamping their boots into the frost-hardened mud. The landscape seemed still save for the faint mist curling above the bare branches of the forests. Then at exactly 7:15 in the morning, the world split open. German artillery roared to life with a fury never before witnessed. More than 1,000 guns, from heavy field pieces to monstrous 408mm howitzers, unleashed their fire simultaneously. The ground shuddered as though the earth itself were convulsing. Shell after shell screamed overhead, bursting with concussive force that shattered trenches, ripped apart villages, and turned the woods into splintered wastelands. For 10 relentless hours, the bombardment continued. The thunder never ceased, an unbroken wall of sound that pressed against the ears, the chest, the very soul. French soldiers crouched in dugouts, their faces gray with fear, as tons of earth collapsed around them. Men were buried alive in their own shelters, clawing desperately at the dirt before suffocating. In some places, trenches simply ceased to exist, replaced by gaping craters filled with smoke and corpses. The forest of Cours, once a quiet grove of fir and oak, was shredded into a wasteland of blackened stumps. The villages north of Verdun, Beaumont, Haumont, Saint-Monu were obliterated. Their stones pulverized their church steeples, collapsing in clouds of dust. Survivors later described the bombardment as though the sky itself had been set on fire, a ceaseless rain of iron and flame. When the guns finally paused and the afternoon silence did not bring relief. Instead, it heralded the next horror. German infantry surged forward in waves, their bayonets glinting through the smoke. They moved with precision, probing French positions, advancing cautiously across no man's land, littered with churned soil and mangled bodies. Flamethrowers hissed, grenades exploded in the ruins, and machine guns raked the survivors who dared to resist. The French, stunned by the violence of the artillery, struggled to respond. Many units had been cut off, their commanders killed, or their trenches erased. Yet pockets of resistance sprang up nonetheless. In the shattered remnants of Carré Wood, Colonel Émile Driant and his 2 battalions of chasseurs held out with desperate courage. For 2 days, they resisted overwhelming numbers, their rifles cracking even as the forest burned around them. Driant himself was killed, refusing to abandon his men, and his stand became an early symbol of French defiance. Still, the German advance was relentless. By February 24th, their forces had seized a string of villages and pushed dangerously close to Verdun's fortified zone. French defenses seemed on the verge of collapse. The bombardment resumed each morning, tearing fresh wounds into the earth, followed by infantry assaults that drove deeper into the French lines. Then came the most shocking blow of all, the fall of Fort Douaumont. On February 25th, a small German detachment slipped through the chaos and found the massive fortress virtually unguarded. Joffre's decision to strip Verdun's forts of their guns and men left Douaumont defended by fewer than 100 reservists. The Germans entered almost unopposed, moving through its silent corridors with disbelief. Within hours, the strongest fortress of Verdun, designed to withstand weeks of siege, had fallen without a serious fight. For the French, the news was devastating. Soldiers on the Sacred Way murmured in disbelief, while in Paris the newspapers screamed of disaster. Douaumont was supposed to be the cornerstone of Verdun's defenses. Its capture, so swift and bloodless, seemed to confirm Falkenhayn's prediction: Verdun would bleed France dry. Yet amidst the chaos, a new figure stepped onto the stage: General Philippe Pétain. On February 26th, Pétain was given command of the Second Army, charged with defending Verdun. A stoic, methodical officer, Pétain was known not for reckless heroics, but for his care of his men and his belief in calculated defense. When he arrived, the situation was dire. Douaumont lost French lines, wavering morale shaken, but Pétain brought with him a steady hand. His first order was simple but revolutionary. The army would rotate its divisions continuously. No unit would remain at Verdun until it was destroyed. Instead, soldiers would cycle in and out, spreading the burden of defense across the entire French army. This system, later called the Noria after the turning of a water wheel, ensured that Verdun would not consume men endlessly without relief. Every French soldier, it was said, would eventually serve at Verdun, but no one would serve until death by exhaustion. Pétain also reinforced the forts that remained, stockpiling supplies and strengthening defenses. He placed artillery to cover every approach, determined that the Germans would pay dearly for every step forward. His voice carried a quiet authority that reassured his weary troops. "Courage," he told them, "on l'Essora. We will get them." Even with Pétain's arrival, the situation remained precarious. The Germans pressed hard along the right bank of the Meuse, pushing closer to Verdun itself. Villages were captured, fields turned into charnel houses. The casualty list lengthened daily. For the French, it seemed as though the very earth was slipping away beneath their feet. And yet something shifted. Despite the horror, despite the losses, Verdun did not fall. The Sacred Way carried reinforcements without pause. Pétain's system spread the burden. Soldiers, though shaken, clung to their positions with grim determination. Each crater, each ruined trench became a fortress in its own right. The battle had begun as Falkenhayn intended, with shock destruction and French retreat. But it was already becoming something more, a test not of fortresses, but of will. For those who endured the opening days, Verdun was seared into memory forever. Survivors spoke of the earth itself, seeming alive, writhing under bombardment, groaning like a wounded beast. They described comrades torn apart by shells, bodies hurled into the air like rag dolls, faces frozen in expressions of terror. They recalled nights lit by the eerie glow of flares, the ground trembling with each distant detonation, the constant whine of shrapnel overhead. It was only the beginning. The storm that had broken on February 21st would not abate in days or weeks. It would grind on for months, stretching into the longest battle of the war. Verdun was not yet consumed, but it had been set alight, and neither side could now abandon it without catastrophe. For Germany, Douaumont's capture was a triumph, a symbol of early success. For France, Pétain's arrival was a lifeline, a chance to hold. Between them lay a battlefield already unrecognizable, a wasteland of fire and death. Verdun had awakened, and it would not sleep again until hundreds of thousands had been consumed. The news of Douaumont's fall struck France like a thunderclap. The fortress had been the largest, newest, and strongest of Verdun's ring, and yet it had been lost almost without a fight. The humiliation was unbearable. In Paris, members of government demanded explanations. In the trenches, soldiers cursed the generals who had stripped the forts of their guns. Verdun was trembling on the edge of disaster, and morale was sinking into despair. It was in this moment of crisis that General Philippe Pétain was summoned. At 59 years old, Pétain was not a young commander. He had risen slowly through the ranks, often overlooked by his superiors. But among soldiers, he was respected. He was known not as a gambler, but as a caretaker, a man who understood the weight of suffering borne by his troops. Where other generals spoke of glory, Pétain spoke of endurance. Where others sacrificed men for abstract gains, he was cautious, deliberate, almost stubbornly defensive. On February 26, 1916, Pétain assumed command of the Second Army at Verdun. His arrival marked a turning point not in immediate fortunes, for the Germans continued to press hard, but in the atmosphere of the defense. He radiated calm. His eyes, deep set and weary, gave the impression of a man who had already contemplated the worst and accepted the burden. His first words to his new command were not promises of swift victory, but a simple vow Verdun would hold. One of Pétain's most significant innovations was the system of rotating divisions, later nicknamed the Noria, after the turning of a water wheel. In the trench warfare of the Western Front, it was common for divisions to be left in place for months, ground down, until only a handful of exhausted survivors remained. Pétain saw that this could not be allowed at Verdun. If France defended the city by annihilating division after division, Falkenhayn's plan would succeed. Instead, Pétain ordered that units be cycled regularly. A division might serve 2 weeks at Verdun, then be withdrawn and replaced by fresh troops. In this way, nearly 3/4 of the French army would pass through Verdun during the course of the battle, but no single unit would be left to wither entirely. This system was not flawless. Soldiers still died in staggering numbers, but it spread the burden across the nation. It meant that Verdun became a shared ordeal, a crucible through which almost every French family would feel a personal connection. To serve at Verdun became a mark of honor, a bond between soldiers from every corner of France, from Brittany to Provence, from Normandy to the Pyrenees. Alongside the rotation, Pétain poured his energy into the artillery defense. He understood that Verdun could not be saved by infantry alone. The Germans had massed their guns to crush everything before them. The French had to answer with equal thunder. Pétain deployed batteries on both banks of the Meuse, positioning them to rake the enemy as they advanced. He demanded more shells, more guns, more logistics, and the Sacred Way answered. Convoys roared day and night, carrying the lifeblood of artillery that allowed Verdun to survive. His style of leadership was also distinctive. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Pétain visited the front frequently. Soldiers saw him trudging through mud, speaking with officers, listening to the complaints of weary men. He was not flamboyant, not inspiring in the oratorical sense, but he was present. That presence mattered. In the cold and the smoke, soldiers felt abandoned by distant generals and chateaux miles from the lines. But Pétain walked among them, his boots caked with the same mud. They began to call him the Lion of Verdun. Under his command, the defense stiffened. Though the Germans pressed with ferocity, seizing villages and advancing along the right bank of the Meuse, they found the French increasingly stubborn. Trenches were rebuilt overnight, shattered units, reassembled counterattacks launched from the ruins of villages. The French line bent, but it did not break. Still, the cost was horrific. In March alone, tens of thousands fell on both sides. The ground became a charnel house where corpses lay frozen in shell holes, half buried by new explosions. The stench of decay clung to every gust of wind. Rats grew fat on the dead, crawling over sleeping men in the trenches. Soldiers described Verdun as a furnace, a place where humanity itself was consumed. Pétain's reports to Paris were blunt. He did not hide the suffering, but neither did he exaggerate. He insisted that reinforcements and shells continue to flow, and he reminded the government that Verdun was not just a military position, but a symbol. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass was not yet the famous rallying cry it would become, but the sentiment already infused his command. Verdun, he believed, must become a fortress of willpower as much as stone. This attitude spread among the troops. Men who rotated out of Verdun carried tales of the inferno to other sectors, describing the constant bombardment, the ceaseless attacks, the unending courage required to hold. Those who had served there spoke of it with grim pride. Verdun became a badge of honor, a shared ordeal that forged solidarity across the French army. Yet even as Pétain organized and endured tension simmered with his superior General Joffre, Joffre favored aggressive offensives, believing that only attack could bring victory. Pétain's defensive strategy, methodical and cautious, irritated him. To Joffre, it seemed too passive, too willing to bleed slowly. As the weeks wore on, political maneuvering in Paris would cast a shadow over Verdun's command. But for now, in the crucible of late winter and early spring 1916, Pétain's steady hand was the reason Verdun did not collapse. On the German side, the mood was different. Falkenhayn's plan seemed to be working. Verdun was absorbing French divisions at a staggering rate. Douaumont was theirs, the French line battered the defenders, fighting desperately. German soldiers, too, endured ghastly conditions, but they believed victory was near. Officers told them they were striking at France's heart, that Verdun would bleed the enemy into surrender. But already cracks were forming. The French artillery on the left bank of the Meuse, high on the ridges of Côte 304 and Le Morhan, began pounding German troops mercilessly. Supply lines grew strained. The German advance slowed, then faltered. What Falkenhayn had envisioned as a swift bleeding of France began instead to look like mutual slaughter. Still, in those early months, it was Pétain who gave France the strength to endure. His calm steadiness transformed despair into grim determination. His rotation system made Verdun a national ordeal rather than a catastrophe for a few divisions. His artillery strategy clawed back balance against German firepower. And above all, his presence reminded soldiers that they were not abandoned, that Verdun was worth every ounce of sacrifice. As spring approached, the battle deepened the hills around Verdun, shaking daily with bombardment. The German tide pressed forward, but the French line hardened. Verdun had not fallen. It would not fall, but neither would it relent. As March unfolded, the storm of Verdun spilled across the Meuse River. The Germans had struck hard on the right bank, seizing Douaumont and threatening the road to the city. But the river itself was no shield. To secure Verdun fully, the Germans needed to control the left bank as well. And so, the hills west of the Meuse became new stages in the Inferno, their names soon etched in legend and horror: Côte 304 and Le Mort Homme Dead Man's Hill. At first glance, these hills were unremarkable. They were simply ridges rising above the rolling landscape, their slopes covered in woods and farmland. Yet their elevation gave them commanding views of the surrounding terrain. Whoever held them could dominate the battlefield with artillery raining fire on the enemy's positions and supply lines. For the Germans to advance further toward Verdun, they needed these heights. For the French, losing them would mean leaving the right bank exposed. Thus, the two hills became prizes worth thousands of lives. The struggle began in early March. German divisions surged forward, their artillery pounding the French trenches with unrelenting fury. Shells tore through the woods, splintering trees into jagged spears. Entire units were buried alive in their dugouts as the earth collapsed upon them. Survivors clawed their way out of the mud only to face the advancing stormtroopers, flamethrowers, hissing grenades, exploding in showers of dirt and flesh. Yet the French refused to yield. Reinforcements poured in via the Sacred Way, exhausted men replaced by fresh divisions. They dug new trenches on the reverse slopes of the hills, turning every contour of the land into a defensive position. Artillery hidden in ravines answered the German barrage, sending counterfire that shattered attacking waves. Soldiers fought not for ground alone, but for honor, for the knowledge that retreat here would doom Verdun itself. The names of the hills quickly took on symbolic meaning. Côte 304, named simply for its height in meters, became a ridge of endless bombardment so battered that its summit was leveled by the shells. Maps soon showed not a hill, but a plateau of craters. Le Mort Homme Dead Man's Hill earned its name from the staggering losses that piled upon its slopes. German officers grimly joked that the hill had become a cemetery more than a battlefield. For French soldiers, the name was no joke. It was prophecy. The fighting was unimaginably savage. Infantry charges dissolved in machine gun fire. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand in shell holes, bayonets, clashing knives, slashing fists, battering mud-streaked faces. One survivor recalled the battlefield as a place where the living and the dead were indistinguishable, where corpses lay half-buried in the muck, and men fought atop them without realizing it. Rain and mud made everything worse. Shell holes filled with water drowning wounded men who could not crawl away. Rifles jammed with dirt boots sank ankle deep, and guns were dragged into position by men who slipped and cursed with every step. The landscape lost all resemblance to nature. It became a churned wasteland, a moonscape of craters, stumps, and mangled bodies. Still, the battle swayed back and forth. Germans captured villages at the foot of the hills only to be driven back by desperate French counterattacks. The French clung to the slopes even as their numbers dwindled. Both sides poured artillery into the fight, saturating the ground with shells until even stones shattered into dust. It was said that no blade of grass remained on Côte 304, no tree left standing on Dead Man's Hill. The cost was appalling. In a single week, tens of thousands were killed or wounded on both sides. The hills became infamous among soldiers across the front. Men whispered their names in dread. To be sent to Côte 304 or Dead Man's Hill was to march into hell. And yet, the orders kept coming, the convoys kept arriving, and the men kept climbing those blasted slopes, knowing most would never descend alive. General Pétain understood the necessity of holding the hills. He poured artillery onto German positions, relentlessly turning the left bank into a cauldron of fire. If they take the heights, he told his staff, they will see everything. We must blind them. His gunners obeyed, hammering enemy batteries, destroying observation posts, filling the air with smoke and steel. For the Germans, the struggle became maddening. They gained ground only to lose it again. They advanced a few hundred meters at the cost of thousands of men, only to be driven back by counterattacks. Falkenhayn had envisioned Verdun as a battle of attrition, but on the left bank, it became attrition without progress. And yet, despite the horror the French line held, the hills did not fall. Côte 304 and Dead Man's Hill remained contested ground soaked in blood but unconquered. The resilience of the French defenders became legendary. They were battered, broken, and often half-mad from the bombardment, but they refused to abandon their posts. Letters from soldiers captured the nightmare. One poilu wrote, "We live among the dead. We eat beside them. We sleep beside them. We fight beside them. Sometimes I do not know if I am alive or already one of them." Another described the battlefield as a mountain of corpses, smoking still from the shells. The symbolism of these hills extended beyond the battlefield. In Paris, news of their defense was broadcast as proof of French courage. Verdun tient, Verdun holds became a refrain. The names Côte 304 and Morhom appeared in headlines, rallying cries for a nation that needed reminders of resilience amidst the slaughter. By April, the left bank struggle had become a battle within the battle, a war of its own. The Germans could not abandon it, for to leave the hills in French hands was to expose their right bank operations. The French could not yield, for to lose the heights was to invite disaster. And so the slaughter continued day after day, week after week, until the hills themselves seemed to groan under the weight of death. Verdun was no longer a single battlefield. It was everywhere, in the forts, in the trenches, in the villages reduced to rubble, and now on the hills west of the Meuse. Every ridge, every slope, every crater became contested ground, fought over with the ferocity of nations fighting for survival. And still, the battle was far from decided. The hills had not fallen, but neither had the Germans relented. Falkenhayn's gamble was unfolding exactly as he intended. France was pouring division after division into the furnace, refusing to abandon sacred ground. Yet Germany too was bleeding heavily. Verdun was becoming what no one had predicted, a mutual crucifixion, where both nations nailed themselves to the same cross of fire and steel. By April 1916, the hills west of the Meuse, Côte 304 and Dead Man's Hill, were strewn with corpses and cratered beyond recognition. The German advance had slowed, the French had held, and Verdun had become a grinding machine, devouring men on both sides. Yet even as the soldiers fought desperately in the mud and smoke, tensions were building far from the trenches and the corridors of French command. General Philippe Pétain, whose steady hand had so far saved Verdun from collapse, was admired by the soldiers, but viewed with suspicion by his superiors. His insistence on defense, on artillery dominance, rotation of divisions, and measured counterattacks clashed with the doctrine of the French High Command. General Joseph Joffre, still commander-in-chief, remained committed to the belief that victory could come only through offense. To Joffre, Pétain's strategy was too cautious, too passive, too much like waiting. And in war, waiting meant bleeding. Pétain, however, was unyielding. He saw Verdun not as an arena for reckless charges, but as a furnace that had to be endured. Every day, his staff tallied the losses, 2,000 here, 3,000. Their divisions shattered within weeks. He knew that launching major offensives in such conditions would only multiply the dead without shifting the line. Verdun, he told his men, must be held with brains and guns, not with blind sacrifice. This philosophy earned him the loyalty of his soldiers, who called him Père Pétain, Father Pétain. They admired that he rotated divisions, sparing them the endless torment of permanent trench duty. They admired that he visited the front mud on his boots, listening to complaints and promising nothing beyond his presence. In an army where many generals were despised as butchers, Pétain was different. But in Paris and at general headquarters, his popularity became a threat. Politicians and senior officers worried that he was becoming too influential. A general beloved by the rank and file could one day become a political figure, even a rival to Joffre himself. And Joffre, whose grip on strategy was already criticized after costly failures in 1915, could not afford rivals. Thus began the quiet maneuvering to sideline him. Joffre's opportunity came in the spring. The British were preparing for their great offensive on the Somme planned for summer. To support it, Joffre wanted a French commander at Verdun who believed in offensive spirit, someone who would not simply hold but attack, bleed the Germans in return, and demonstrate French resolve. Pétain, with his deliberate caution, was not that man. In May, Joffre promoted Pétain seemingly a reward, but in reality a removal. He elevated him to command Army Group Center, a position with wider responsibilities, but one that took him away from the immediate control of Verdun. In his place, Joffre installed General Robert Nivelle as commander of the Second Army at Verdun. Nivelle was a very different man, confident, aggressive, and eloquent. He believed firmly in the power of the offensive and was willing to spend lives to prove it. The soldiers noticed the change. Where Pétain had been cautious, Nivelle spoke of glory. Where Pétain had emphasized survival. Nivelle promised that bold strokes could shatter the Germans. Some men admired his energy, others muttered that he would waste them. But for Joffre and the government, Nivelle's appointment was politically useful. He was not too popular, not too independent, and he believed in attack. Still, Pétain's shadow remained. Even as he departed Verdun, his system of rotation and his emphasis on artillery lingered. The soldiers remembered him with affection, and many officers continued his methods. Verdun had become synonymous with Pétain's name, and nothing could erase that. Meanwhile, the German high command was also wrestling with tension. Falkenhayn had promised that Verdun would bleed France white, but as weeks turned into months, it was Germany that was hemorrhaging as well. The French had indeed poured division after division into Verdun, but the Germans were forced to match them, feeding their own men into the grinder. The vision of a one-sided attritional victory was fading into the reality of mutual slaughter. On the battlefield, this translated into desperate struggles for inches of ground. In May, the French attempted to recapture Fort Douaumont, lost so easily in February. For 5 days, they pounded it with colossal artillery, 370-meter shells that tore into the fortress walls. On May 22nd, French infantry stormed forward, bayonets fixed their officers, shouting encouragement. For a few hours, they gained a foothold inside the fortress, fighting room by room through the smoke-filled corridors. But German reinforcements counterattacked, sealing off the breaches and surrounding the intruders. Cut off and outnumbered, the French survivors were forced to surrender. The attack had failed. Douaumont remained in German hands, and the cost had been staggering. Yet Nivelle and Joffre insisted it was proof of offensive spirit of France's determination to fight not just defensively, but with teeth. To the soldiers, it was another massacre. Politics and ambition were shaping Verdun as much as strategy. Joffre needed a victory to reassure Paris and to strengthen his authority before the Somme offensive began. Nivelle, eager to prove himself, embraced the rhetoric of attack. Pétain, watching from his new post, worried that Verdun would once again devour lives needlessly. He wrote bluntly to his superiors, "This battle must not be allowed to become another Champagne." But his words carried less weight now. For the soldiers, command changes mattered little compared to the daily reality. Shells still fell in unbroken waves. The ground still shook the air, still reeked of death. They fought not for the ambitions of generals, but for their comrades beside them, for the hope of surviving long enough to be rotated out, for the stubborn refusal to let the Germans pass. Yet the clash of personalities, Pétain's caution, Joffre's ambition, Nivelle's aggressiveness, would shape the course of Verdun. What had begun as Falkenhayn's plan to bleed France white was now also a battle of French generals, each fighting not only the enemy but each other's reputations. Verdun had become not just a battlefield, but a stage upon which careers rose and fell, where political survival was fought with as much ferocity as the trenches themselves. And still the guns thundered. By early May 1916, Fort Douaumont had already become the dark heart of Verdun. Once France's pride, it was now in German hands, a looming reminder of the humiliation suffered in February. Its thick concrete galleries and armored turrets gave the occupiers shelter and prestige. For the Germans, it was proof that Falkenhayn's plan was working. For the French, it was a wound that festered daily. But Douaumont would soon prove as dangerous to its captors as to its enemies. On May 8, 1916, disaster struck. Deep inside the fortress, German troops were crowded in the vaulted chambers, infantrymen resting, gunners waiting for orders, cooks preparing meals. Accounts vary on what happened next. One version tells of soldiers attempting to heat coffee with a flamethrower, a reckless misuse of a weapon designed to terrorize enemies in trenches. Another version blames a carelessly handled grenade. Whatever the cause, the result was catastrophic fire erupted in the magazine stores, where tons of shells and explosives were kept. The blast thundered through the fort, tearing open chambers and engulfing men in flame. The air filled with smoke so thick that soldiers suffocated before they could find exits. Flames raced along corridors, ammunition cooking off in violent bursts. Hundreds of men died in minutes, many burned beyond recognition. Survivors stumbled out into the daylight, their uniforms charred, their faces black and coughing blood from scorched lungs. Outside, French observers saw smoke billowing from Douaumont and thought it the result of their bombardment. Inside, chaos reigned. German engineers struggled to contain the blaze, shoveling earth over the flames, carrying the wounded through choking tunnels, piling corpses in corners until they could be dragged out later. The pride of Germany's capture had become a death trap for its own soldiers. The explosion killed as many as 700 men, though exact numbers remain uncertain. For morale, the blow was immense. German soldiers began to mutter that the fort was cursed, that the French dead still haunted its galleries. Officers tried to maintain discipline, but the survivors could not forget the horror, the screams of comrades trapped behind collapsing doors, the stench of burning flesh lingering in the air for days. The French High Command, seizing on the opportunity, ordered an immediate assault. General Nivelle, newly in command at Verdun, saw a chance to reclaim the fortress that had been lost so ignominiously. Retaking Douaumont would erase the stain of February and give France a symbolic victory. Plans were laid quickly, artillery bombardment scheduled, infantry briefed. From May 17th to 21, French guns roared, unleashing some of the heaviest fire yet seen at Verdun. Massive shells, 300mm and 400mm monsters slammed into the fort, collapsing walls, tearing away armor and reducing outworks to rubble. Observation balloons floated high above, directing fire with precision. German defenders, still reeling from the explosion, huddled in shattered galleries as dust and smoke filled their lungs. On May 22nd, the French infantry advanced. Among them were the men of the 129th Infantry Regiment, veterans of earlier battles, grim-faced and determined. They crossed no man's land under the cover of artillery, leaping into the ruined outer works of Douaumont. For the first time in months, French boots echoed in its halls. The fighting inside was savage. Grenades exploded in dark corridors, filling the air with choking dust. Men fired revolvers at shadows, bayonets thrust blindly in the smoke. The French managed to seize part of the western section, raising their flag above the ruins. For a brief moment, jubilation swept the trenches. Messages sped back, Douaumont retaken. Paris prepared to celebrate. But triumph was short-lived. German reinforcements rushed forward, storming the fort with overwhelming numbers. Flamethrowers hissed through the corridors, their jets of fire consuming defenders in seconds. Isolated pockets of French soldiers fought desperately, surrounded and cut off. Some tried to break out, others were incinerated in place. By the end of the day, the French foothold had been erased. Douaumont remained in German hands. The cost was horrifying. Thousands of French soldiers lay dead or wounded around the fortress. Whole companies had vanished in the smoke. The attack that was supposed to restore honor instead became another scar. Soldiers muttered bitterly that their lives had been thrown away for politics, for appearances, for the vanity of generals who wanted headlines in Paris. Yet, despite the failure, the attempt had shown something crucial. Verdun's defense was no longer a passive shield. Under Nivelle's command, the French would not only endure, but strike back. Ils ne passeront pas, they shall not pass, was becoming more than a slogan. It was being written in blood and futile attacks as well as stubborn defense. For the Germans, the disaster at Douaumont was twofold. The accidental explosion had cost them hundreds of men and shaken morale. The French assault, though repelled, proved that Verdun would never be an easy prize. Falkenhayn's theory of attrition was working, but not as he had envisioned. Both sides were bleeding, both sides pouring men into the grinder. And still, Douaumont loomed. Its blackened walls, scarred by shells, stood as a monument to endurance and death. Inside, the stench of burned flesh lingered for weeks. French shells continued to hammer it daily, shaking its foundations, collapsing tunnels burying men alive. German garrisons rotated in and out each new wave, dreading their turn in the cursed fortress. For the French soldiers who had charged its ruins, Douaumont became a symbol of futility and sacrifice. One survivor of the May assault later wrote, "The fort is not stone, it is a furnace. We entered as men, we emerged as shadows. Those who did not emerge are still there, buried beneath its walls, their voices echoing in the dark." The failure did not break French resolve. If anything, it hardened it. Douaumont remained in German hands, but its capture was no longer a symbol of triumph. It was a tomb draining German strength as surely as French. The Germans held it, but at a price they could not ignore. By late May, Verdun had already consumed more than either side expected. Falkenhayn had set out to bleed France white, but Germany too was hemorrhaging, and the battle was only halfway begun. Ahead lay new horrors, fortresses that would fall, villages that would vanish, hills that would be fought over until nothing remained but ash and bone. Verdun was no longer a campaign. It was becoming a crucifixion, a place where both nations nailed themselves to suffering and refused to climb down. If Douaumont had fallen with barely a shot fired, Fort Vaux would be remembered for the opposite, a defiant stand that turned its underground galleries into legend. By June 1916, Vaux was already battered by months of artillery. Its stone walls were cracked, its steel turrets dented its air heavy with dust and fumes. Yet inside Major Sylvain Eugène Raynal, the fort's commander, maintained a fragile order. He was a man of discipline, wiry and sharp, with a stubborn will that matched the fortress itself. His garrison numbered just over 600 men, infantry, engineers, gunners crammed into the damp galleries that had become their home. From June 1st, German artillery began a bombardment unlike anything Vaux had endured before. For days, shells of every caliber pounded the fort. Whole sections of wall collapsed, ceilings cracked. The air inside grew foul with smoke and the smell of burning powder. The men huddled in the gloom, their ears ringing, their nerves stretched thin. On June 2nd, the German infantry came. They surged across the cratered ground, advancing under the cover of their guns. Flamethrowers hissed, grenades arced through the air, and machine guns rattled in the ruins. The French met them with desperate fire rifles and machine guns blazing from shattered embrasures. The first waves were driven back, but more came pressing closer to the fort. The Germans soon discovered that Vaux was not Douaumont. Where Douaumont had been nearly empty, Vaux was alive with resistance. Raynal directed his men from a central chamber, sending orders through runners, shouting encouragement in the smoke. He refused to surrender an inch. When German troops reached the outer works, French grenades hurled them back. When they tried to storm the entrances, machine guns cut them down. But the pressure mounted. Flamethrowers sent jets of fire into the narrow corridors, filling them with suffocating smoke. Grenades burst in the dark, echoing off the stone like thunder. Fighting became hand-to-hand bayonets thrust in confined spaces, knives flashing in the dim light. The French sealed doors with rubble, fought behind barricades of sandbags and corpses, retreating chamber by chamber but never yielding. By June 3rd, conditions inside the fort were unbearable. The garrison's water supply was almost gone. Only 12 gallons remained for 600 men. Thirst gnawed at the soldiers, their lips cracked, their tongues swollen. The heat from fires and flamethrowers made the air stifling. Men licked condensation from walls, drank from puddles fouled with dust and blood. Still, they fought on. Raynal refused despair. When communication lines were cut, he turned to the most unlikely of allies, carrier pigeons. One by one, he sent them into the sky with desperate messages. On June 4th, he released his last pigeon, known today as Le Vaillant, the Brave. The bird was already weakened by gas, its feathers singed, but it flew across the battlefield with Raynal's plea. "We are still holding, but supplies exhausted. Send help quickly. This is my last pigeon." The message reached Verdun's citadel. For its service, the pigeon was awarded the Légion d'honneur, the highest French decoration, a rare honor for an animal. It became a symbol of desperate endurance, proof that even in the depths of the fortress, hope still fluttered on fragile wings. But hope alone could not hold Vaux. By June 5th, the fort was a furnace. The Germans had broken into the galleries, the French retreating deeper underground. Men fought in pitch darkness, choking on smoke, slipping on blood-slick floors. Ammunition ran low, water was gone, and the wounded groaned in the corners. Raynal, his face blackened with soot, continued to direct the defense riding orders with a trembling hand, refusing to admit defeat. On June 7th, the end came. With only a trickle of water left, his men collapsing from thirst and exhaustion, Raynal accepted that further resistance was impossible. To fight on would mean nothing but death. He gathered his officers, gave his final orders, and prepared to surrender. When the Germans entered the central chamber, they did not find cowards. They found men hollow-eyed with thirst, gaunt from hunger, still clutching their rifles, though they could barely stand. Raynal stepped forward, offering his sword as tradition demanded. To the surprise of many, Crown Prince Wilhelm, commander of the German Fifth Army, honored him. He returned the sword, praising Raynal's courage. In a battle defined by horror, this moment of chivalry shone briefly, a relic of an older code of war. The fall of Fort Vaux was a German victory, but it was not triumph. The garrison had resisted for nearly a week under impossible conditions, holding off overwhelming numbers until thirst forced surrender. For France, Raynal and his men became heroes. Newspapers in Paris hailed their stand, poets wrote verses about the pigeon, and soldiers whispered of Vaux as proof that Verdun's soul could not be broken. For the Germans, the cost was sobering. They had taken the fort, yes, but only after days of bloody struggle that drained divisions and shattered morale. The plan to bleed France white was working, but it was bleeding Germany too. The ruins of Vaux, blackened and broken, became another monument to the futility of Verdun. Its walls, once solid, were pocked with holes, its corridors filled with rubble and corpses. Survivors on both sides carried the memory with them forever. The thirst, the smoke, the cries in the dark. Raynal himself was taken prisoner, but he was remembered as the man who made Vaux immortal. His name joined that of Colonel Driant at Corus Wood and countless others who had resisted beyond reason. For the poilus who marched past the ruins in later months, the story of Vaux was inspiration. If those men could endure, so could they. Verdun was not merely a battle of guns. It was a battle of legends, of moments where human endurance defied logic. Fort Vaux proved that even when stone cracked and water ran dry, the spirit of resistance could blaze like fire in the dark. Yet for all the heroism, the line still bled. The Germans pressed on, the French resisted, and the hills shook daily under new bombardments. The fall of Vaux did not end the battle, it only deepened it. Verdun's crucifixion was far from over. The fall of Fort Vaux in June might have seemed the prelude to Verdun's collapse. Douaumont was still in German hands. Vaux had surrendered after a week of hell, and the French defenders were staggering under the weight of exhaustion. Yet it was at this darkest moment that Verdun gained its most enduring legend, a phrase that would outlive the battle itself. Ils ne passeront pas, they shall not pass. The words were spoken by General Robert Nivelle, who had replaced Pétain as commander of the Second Army. Unlike Pétain, cautious and deliberate, Nivelle was bold, aggressive, and confident. His soldiers joked that he spoke like a man writing for the newspapers, but his rhetoric carried power. When German forces surged again on June 23rd, preparing to push deeper toward Verdun, Nivelle exhorted his men with the promise that they would hold the line no matter the cost. Vous ne les laisserez pas passer, mes camarades. You will not let them pass, my comrades. The phrase raced across France like wildfire. Newspapers printed it in bold type posters, carried it into villages, and soldiers repeated it in the trenches. What began as a commander's order became a national vow. To the poilus who staggered through mud and blood, the words offered defiance in the face of annihilation. To civilians in Paris, they became reassurance that Verdun would not fall, that France would not be broken. On the battlefield, the Germans pressed their attack with ferocity. Their goal was the heights overlooking Verdun, the ridges that would give them dominance over the city and the sacred way. They struck at Douaumont, at Fleury, at the slopes leading toward Souville. The bombardments were constant, the infantry assaults relentless. Whole villages vanished under the shells, reduced to stones and dust. Fleury alone would change hands more than a dozen times in the summer of 1916. The French resisted with equal ferocity. Artillery thundered from the left bank where Côte 304 and Dead Man's Hill still held. Every attack was met with counterfire, every gain contested with counterattack. The battlefield became a graveyard of men and machines, a place where even victory felt like defeat. Amid this inferno, Nivelle's phrase hardened into legend. "They shall not pass" was more than defiance. It was prophecy. Soldiers wrote it on dugout walls, scrawled it on helmets, whispered it to each other in the moments before going over the top. For many, it was the last words they ever spoke. Yet as the Germans pounded Verdun, events elsewhere began to shift the balance. On July 1st, 1916, the British launched their Great Offensive on the Somme. Intended as a joint Anglo-French effort, the Somme became primarily a British battle, as French forces were still locked in Verdun. The offensive, though catastrophic in its opening day for Britain, forced the Germans to divert divisions and artillery away from Verdun. The French defenders felt the pressure ease slightly, like a drowning man who suddenly surfaces for a gasp of air. The coincidence was crucial. Falkenhayn's plan had always been to bleed France white, but with the Somme now devouring German strength as well, the arithmetic of attrition was changing. Germany could no longer concentrate fully on Verdun. It had to fight two furnaces at once. Still, the summer battles around Verdun were among the most horrific of the entire war. Fleury, the village at the heart of the struggle, was obliterated so completely that after the war, it would be declared died, for France never rebuilt. Souville became a blasted ruin, its walls shaking under bombardment, its underground passages filled with wounded men gasping for air in the stench of powder and rot. In one particularly desperate moment, German stormtroopers advanced so close to Fort Souville that they looked down upon Verdun itself, the city smoking in the distance. For a heartbeat, it seemed the French line would collapse entirely, but artillery and counterattacks drove them back. Verdun held by inches, then by feet, then by sheer willpower. The cost was staggering. By midsummer, both armies were bleeding in torrents. Men collapsed from exhaustion as often as from wounds. Bodies lay unburied, rotting in the heat, swarmed by flies. The air was thick with the stench of decay mixed with cordite and chlorine gas. Soldiers spoke of Verdun as a place outside of life, where the world itself seemed to have ended. And yet, the French clung on. They clung not because the ground was worth it militarily, but because to abandon it was unthinkable. Verdun had become France's altar of sacrifice, and every life given there was laid upon it with grim determination. Nivelle's words gave this sacrifice a name: "They shall not pass." In Paris, the phrase became a rallying cry for the entire war effort. Posters showed French soldiers standing firm against waves of gray-clad Germans, the slogan emblazoned above. Civilians repeated it in the streets, children learned it in school. It was more than military propaganda. It was a mantra of national survival. For the Germans, the summer battles were equally ruinous. Their divisions rotated again and again into the furnace, returned shattered. Officers began to doubt Falkenhayn's promise of easy attrition. Instead of bleeding France white, Verdun was bleeding Germany as well. And with the Somme raging in the north, the strain was becoming unbearable. By late summer, Verdun had already consumed more than 500,000 men dead, wounded, or missing. The ground was so torn by shells that it no longer resembled Earth, but a sea of craters. Forests had vanished, villages erased, hills flattened. Survivors spoke of the battlefield as a lunar landscape, gray and lifeless, where even the birds had fled. Yet amidst the ruin, the phrase endured. "They shall not pass" was not merely shouted, it was lived. It was carved into the very soil by men who refused to yield, by divisions that returned again and again until they were shadows of themselves. Verdun had become a paradox, a place of unspeakable suffering, and yet also the birthplace of an unbreakable legend. By September, the worst of the German assaults had slowed. The Somme continued to devour their reserves. Romania entered the war on the side of the Allies, and Falkenhayn himself was dismissed, replaced by Hindenburg and Ludendorff. Verdun had not fallen. France had not been bled white. And though the price was almost beyond comprehension, the words of Nivelle had proven true. Ils ne passeront pas. By late summer 1916, the Great Furnace of Verdun had already devoured hundreds of thousands of lives, and still the line refused to break. Falkenhayn's gamble to bleed France white was faltering. His arithmetic of attrition had not accounted for the stubbornness of the poilus, nor for the arrival of the Somme offensive, which drew German divisions away from Verdun's killing fields. Instead of weakening only France, Verdun had become a mutual crucifixion. In Berlin, patience with Falkenhayn was wearing thin. His position had always been precarious, overshadowed by the rising prestige of Paul von Hindenburg and his chief of staff, Erich Ludendorff. Together, the two Eastern commanders had become legends after their victory at Tannenberg in 1914. Their names were celebrated in the press, their portraits hung in homes, and the public hailed them as saviors of the fatherland. Falkenhayn, by contrast, was increasingly seen as the architect of a slaughter without end. The Kaiser, pressured by both political rivals and military realities, made his decision on August 29, 1916. Falkenhayn was dismissed as chief of the general staff. In his place, the Kaiser elevated Hindenburg with Ludendorff effectively as his deputy. The change was more than personal, it was strategic. Hindenburg and Ludendorff brought with them a new vision of the war, one that extended far beyond the trenches of Verdun. For Falkenhayn, the dismissal was bitter. He had staked his reputation on Verdun, believing it to be the key to breaking France. Instead, it had become his undoing. His colleagues whispered that he had sacrificed hundreds of thousands for nothing. History would remember him not for victory, but for a plan that bled both armies dry. For the German army at Verdun, the change in command brought a shift in momentum. Hindenburg and Ludendorff did not share Falkenhayn's obsession with the Meuse. They saw Verdun as a drain, a battlefield that consumed men and shells without offering decisive gain. Their focus turned elsewhere, the Somme-Romania's entry into the war and the Eastern Front, where opportunities still seemed greater. Verdun, once the centerpiece of German strategy, was now relegated to a secondary front. Orders went out. Offensive operations at Verdun would be scaled back. No longer would the Germans hurl wave after wave against French positions in hopes of a breakthrough. Instead, they dug in, consolidating their gains around Douaumont and Vaux, content to hold rather than to advance. The initiative for the first time in months shifted to the French. This decision was not immediately obvious to the men on the ground. Shells still fell daily attacks, and counterattacks still flared along the front. But slowly, the tempo changed. The great hammer blows of Falkenhayn's plan gave way to a grinding stalemate. German soldiers who had once been promised swift triumph now whispered of endless waiting, of being buried alive in the forts they had captured. For the French, the change in German command was less visible, but equally significant. They sensed that the tide was turning. The enemy no longer pressed with the same ferocity. Reinforcements arrived more regularly. Artillery fire began to dominate once again, and morale crept upward. Verdun was still hell, but it was no longer hopeless. The political meaning of Hindenburg's rise, however, was immense. To Germany, his appointment symbolized unity and strength, a rallying figure who could guide the nation through the war's grimmest years. To the Allies, it was both a warning and an opportunity. Hindenburg's reputation was formidable, but his shift of attention away from Verdun confirmed that the German grip on the fortress city was loosening. Meanwhile, at Verdun itself, the battle had settled into a grisly stalemate. The ruins of Fleury-Thiaumont and Souville smoldered. Corpses lay unburied in the craters, their features eroded by rain and sun until they seemed part of the earth itself. Trenches filled with water and filth, rats feeding on the dead without fear of bayonets. Soldiers trudged through this wasteland like ghosts, their uniforms in tatters, their eyes hollow. The psychological toll was immense. One French soldier wrote, "The land is dead, and we live only to die." Verdun is no place of men, but of shadows. A German counterpart described the ground as an open grave where the living and the dead are indistinguishable. Yet through this horror, hope flickered. The French now whispered that the worst was behind them. The Sacred Way still carried its endless convoys. Artillery from the left bank still thundered across the river, blunting German efforts. And with the Germans digging in rather than advancing, French commanders began to plan something that had seemed impossible months before a counterattack. Pétain, though no longer in direct command at Verdun, continued to shape strategy from his broader command post. His insistence on careful preparation, massive artillery support, and methodical advance influenced the plans of Nivelle and Mangin, who would soon launch the offensives that turned Verdun from a defensive struggle into a story of reclamation. In hindsight, Falkenhayn's dismissal marked Verdun's turning point. Though the battle would rage for months still, though thousands more would perish in the forts and trenches, the tide had shifted. The German High Command no longer believed Verdun could bring victory. They had abandoned the hope of bleeding France white. From that moment forward, Verdun was no longer a German offensive, it was a French one. And so, as the guns roared into autumn, the defenders who had clung desperately to every inch of ground found themselves transformed. They were no longer merely holding, they were preparing to strike back. Verdun, the crucifixion of France, was about to become its resurrection. By autumn 1916, Verdun was no longer the German hammer it had been in February. Hindenburg and Ludendorff had diverted their focus elsewhere, and the French, sensing the change, prepared to seize the initiative. After months of endurance, Verdun would no longer be merely a defensive struggle. It was time to reclaim what had been lost. The plan was deliberate, shaped by the lessons of the previous months. Gone were the reckless frontal assaults that had bled divisions dry. In their place came methodical preparation, massive artillery bombardments, careful coordination, and creeping barrages that advanced step by step with the infantry. The French army, battered but not broken, was about to show that it had learned how to fight Verdun's war. The first target was the symbol of humiliation itself, Fort Douaumont. For 8 months, it had loomed under German occupation, its blackened walls a taunt to French pride. On October 24, 1916, the French guns opened fire. More than 700 heavy pieces roared, pounding the fortress with shells so immense that they collapsed entire sections of its structure. Smoke and fire cloaked the hill German defenders, staggering within the trembling galleries. Then the infantry advanced. Under the cover of a double creeping barrage, French troops moved steadily forward, their steps almost in rhythm with the thunder ahead of them. This time, there was no reckless rush, no blind sacrifice. The artillery cleared the way, smashing machine gun nests and silencing batteries. When the French reached the fort, they found its garrison stunned, its walls cracked, its will broken. Within hours, the tricolor flew again above Douaumont. The capture was more than military. It was a symbol, a wound healed, a humiliation avenged. Paris erupted in celebration. Soldiers wept in the mud, embracing one another. The fort that had fallen without resistance in February had been retaken in triumph in October. Verdun was no longer merely survival, it was vindication. 2 weeks later, attention turned to Fort Vaux, that tomb of thirst and courage. Since its fall in June, the Germans had clung to it despite constant bombardment. But by November, French artillery had reduced much of it to rubble. On November 2nd, under relentless fire, the Germans evacuated. French troops re-entered without a fight, reclaiming the site where Major Raynal and his men had written their legend. The spirit of Vaux returned to French hands, its ruins once more a monument to sacrifice rather than defeat. The counteroffensive culminated in December 1916 when General Charles Mangin launched a meticulously prepared assault. For 6 days, more than 1.1 million shells battered German positions north of Verdun. The ground shook as if in an earthquake. Villages obliterated, forests churned to dust. Artillery observation aircraft circled overhead, directing the barrage with precision. At 10 a.m. on December 15th, the infantry advanced behind a rolling wall of fire shrapnel and high explosives sweeping the ground just meters ahead of them. The effect was devastating. German defenses, already strained, collapsed under the bombardment. Thousands surrendered in shock, their trenches shredded, their nerves shattered. French troops surged forward, capturing over 11,000 prisoners and 115 guns in a single day. By December 18th, the French line had advanced more than 7 kilometers, pushing the Germans back beyond the ground they had held since February. The battle was not a sweeping maneuver, not the grand breakthroughs dreamed of in 1914. but it was decisive in its own way. Verdun, the fortress that Falkenhayn had chosen to bleed France to death, had survived. Not only survived, it had triumphed. The French had retaken the forts, reclaimed the ground, and turned a symbol of despair into a beacon of endurance. Yet the victory was drenched in blood. From February 21st to December 18th, Verdun had claimed over 700,000 casualties, around 350,000 French and 350,000 German, with nearly 150,000 dead on each side. 10 months of slaughter had produced no decisive territorial change, no breakthrough, no shift in the war's stalemate. And yet, Verdun mattered. It mattered because it proved that France would not break. It mattered because it consumed German strength at the very moment Britain and France were fighting on the Somme. It mattered because it gave birth to legends: the Sacred Way, the Pigeon Le Vaillant, the Stand at Fort Vaux, the Cry of Ils ne passeront pas. It mattered because in a war that so often seemed meaningless, Verdun became a symbol that both armies and indeed the world could not forget. The land itself bore witness. After the battle, the ground was so devastated that it could not be restored. Villages like Fleury-Bezonvaux and Ornes ceased to exist, officially declared villages morts pour la France, villages that died for France. The soil, poisoned by shells and corpses, could no longer sustain crops. Even today, a century later, the scars remain forests planted over cratered fields. Cemeteries stretching across the hills, ossuaries filled with the bones of the unknown dead. For the men who fought there, Verdun was not just a memory, but a brand burned into their souls. Survivors carried it for life, the thunder of bombardments echoing in their dreams, the stench of corpses haunting every breath, the sight of comrades vanishing in fire and smoke. To them, Verdun was not victory or defeat. It was endurance, suffering, survival. For France, Verdun became a national shrine. The cry of "they shall not pass" entered the national consciousness, repeated by schoolchildren carved into monuments invoked in later wars. The battle, though senseless in its destruction, gave France something it desperately needed in 1916, proof that it could withstand anything, that its heart could not be broken. For Germany, Verdun was a warning. It revealed the limits of attrition, the folly of believing that one battle could bleed a nation into surrender. Falkenhayn's gamble had consumed his career, his strategy abandoned in failure. Hindenburg and Ludendorff turned elsewhere, but the memory of Verdun haunted German soldiers for the rest of the war. In the end, Verdun stood as both triumph and tragedy. It was the longest battle of the Great War, nearly 10 months of unbroken carnage. It was a graveyard of villages, a furnace of men, a monument to the futility of modern war. And yet, it was also the moment when France, battered and bleeding, refused to die. When the guns finally fell silent on December 18th, the fields of Verdun were still smoking, the trenches still littered with the dead. But the French flag flew again above Douaumont and Vaux, and the road to Paris remained closed. Verdun had endured. In the words of one soldier who survived it, "We were not fighting for ground, nor for glory, nor even for victory. We fought because Verdun was France and France was Verdun. And so long as we stood, France stood." Verdun had become immortal.